you're here for the call with American Promise, all about how to have effective meetings with elected officials and candidates and how to use the Candidate Pledge program, you are absolutely in the right place. It's about 8 here on the East Coast, and we're going to go ahead and get the call started. For anyone new to these calls or new to American Promise, I'll just lead with American Promise is a single issue organization, and it's a big single issue. We're organizing Americans to win a constitutional amendment to restore American democracy in which we, the people, not corporations, not unions, not special interests, govern ourselves. And my name's Azer Cole. I'm the state manager for American Promise. And that means, among other things, that I help people have effective meetings with elected officials, even if those meetings are now virtual. And I direct our National Candidate Pledge program. And these two things, how to have effective virtual meetings with elected officials and how to successfully use the Candidate Pledge program, are going to be the two topics of tonight's call. And I don't know about a lot of you guys, but I work from home every day these days. And I don't know exactly when I'll be back in the office. I don't know exactly when I'll have an in-person meeting with my elected official either. But I do know from experience that it is very possible to still have powerful meetings with your elected officials through all levels of government. And it might even be more accessible than it was before. You know, your friend lives an hour away from you for your US senator, all of a sudden you can be in the same meeting, each in your respective living rooms, rather than having to drive half an hour and meet in the middle. And tonight we're thrilled to be joined by two guest speakers. I'll introduce both of them here as we get going through the call. The first is Brad Fitch, who I'll introduce here in a second. And he's going to talk us through how to have these meetings with elected officials and candidates running for public office virtually. And then later on, we'll hear from Laura Knipmeyer as we transition to talking about the Candidate Pledge program and how you can use this powerful tool in your meetings with elected officials. And throughout the call, as you have questions, just use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions. That'll really be the best way to get those to us so we have time to get them answered. And I'm going to introduce our first guest speaker, Brad, here. Brad spent 25 years in Washington as a journalist, as a congressional aide, consultant, a college instructor, internet entrepreneur, and writer/researcher. He began his career in radio and TV in the 80s, started working at Capitol Hill in 1988, where he served for 13 years. He's worked on a variety of positions for 4 members of Congress, including press secretary, campaign manager, legislative director, and chief of staff. Among other things, he is the author of Citizens Handbook to Influencing Elected Officials, and he joins us currently in his capacity as president and CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation, an organization all about building trust in our democratic process. The Congressional Management Foundation advances this goal by working directly with members of Congress and staff to enhance their operations and interactions with constituents, and in turn, also works directly with citizen groups to guide them in effective advocacy. Just a bridge builder, if there ever was one. So Brad, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ezra. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to American Promise. I had the opportunity a few years ago to go to one of your first sessions in Washington, D.C., where I was able to speak as a panelist. And I got to admit, when I walked into it, I was a little skeptical. And I mean, I'm trying to help improve and build trust in Congress. And I think I'm playing Don Quixote. And I said, these guys got me beat. And I was won over. I was amazed at the passion, the interest, the ability of the volunteers that Jeff and Izor have built up here at American Promise. And so I'm delighted to be part of this. We're also both members of the Bridge Alliance, which is, if you're not familiar with it, kind of the trade association for democracy reform, which has been started in the last few years. It's 5 years old. It's growing. More than 100 organizations are part of the Bridge Alliance that are trying to restore democracy. And so we're all part of this growing movement, which is really exciting that there's so many Americans that are getting involved in it. And that's why I agreed to work with you here today, actually donate my services. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I am a PowerPoint fanatic. I will warn you in advance, and live and die by my PowerPoint. And you're going to see the title of the program is Building Relationships with Lawmakers Remotely. And as Azor said, it is about meetings, and that's a part of it. But it's also about looking at the long term, especially when you're going for something as huge as a constitutional amendment. You're going to want to understand and appreciate that it's going to take time, that they may not sign the pledge this year, they may not sign the pledge next week, but persistently working with them and building their relationships with them is what matters. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. First, give you a little more background on my organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization formed in 1977. We're 43 years old. We're one of the leading trainers and consultants for the United States Congress. We're kind of like the small business consultants for the United States Congress. More than 1,000 staffers from 3/4 of the Congress participate on an annual basis. That number is actually even higher this year because when they had to move remote, the Congressional Management Foundation pivoted and provided a lot of training and services. But as you all know, we also are the leading trainers of citizen advocates. We do these unique training studies unique studies and trainings and research. And I'm going to share with you some of that research on how you can build better relationships, understanding, and connections to politicians, both as candidates and as lawmakers. Now, I'm going to intertwine those words because there's really no difference. They're the same people. Now, they may be motivated by different things at different times of the year. Don't get me wrong. As Azor said, I've worked with Congress for 30 years, and they get a lot more interested in voters' opinions 3 months before an election than 3 years. And that definitely happens. But in general, their motivations, what drives them and what influences them, and that's what's important, is the same. They're the same human beings in the end. Before we get started, I want to provide you a couple of resources that are available to you, some free, one not. We created on our website at congressfoundation.org a section called the Citizen Resource Center. And the best way to do it is just type in these words in Google, Citizen Resource Center, and our initial CMF. We've provided a link in the chat. So if you want to just click on that, you'll get to that particular section. And it really takes our research, all of our free resources, and breaks it into these 3 areas: how Congress really works, how to communicate with Congress, and how to schedule and conduct meetings with members of Congress. It includes short articles and blogs, as well as lengthier reports. So we encourage you to tap into that. And as Azor said, I'm also the author of a booklet called The Citizens Handbook to Influencing Elected Officials. It's available on Amazon. We also sent it to you. It's 99 cents on Kindle. I don't make a lot of money off of this, I assure you. It was a labor of love. I really passionately wanted to write this book about 8 years ago when I had all this information in my head that citizens' voices could make a difference, and I wanted it in the marketplace of ideas. So it's doing pretty good. I got a 4.3 out of 5 on Amazon. I'm wanting to get a little higher, so if you get the book, rate me, because I'm competing with a couple other authors, and they're beating me out right now. They got 4.9s, 5.0s, it's incredible. So let's start out by framing this. We all recognize that getting our friends and neighbors involved in citizen engagement is really hard because we're facing a lot of cynicism in our society today. Every day we're bombarded with headlines like 8 in 10 Americans are unhappy with Congress, or there's ethics issues tarnishing the institution, or my personal favorite, Americans hate Congress because Congress doesn't care about Americans. That's nice and subtle. And the reality is Americans have lost so much faith in this institution. And let me share with you one pretty depressing statistic that we got from the Rasmussen polling company. A national survey of Americans asked this question: do most members of Congress care what their constituents think? And only 11%, 1 out of 10 Americans, would agree with that statement. Now, a lot of people look to the job approval ratings of Congress as an indicator of the ill health of our democracy. I think this statistic is scarier because when the governed does not believe the governing are listening to them, then you're really messing with some of the fundamental precepts upon which our democracy was founded. So why is that? Why do we have such a cynical view? Well, I blame these guys, but then again, I blame Hollywood for a lot of things. And by the way, folks, this is not a documentary. They got the decorations in the majority leader's office right, and that's it. Everything else you see in House of Cards is a little bit bunk. Because when you actually talk to members of Congress, and you, like we do, and see their inside view, their motivations are actually quite different. We did a survey of actual members of the House of Representatives, and we asked them this question right here. How important is this aspect to your effectiveness as a representative? One of the only surveys ever done of House members, the only time this question was ever asked of House members. And this is what we found out. Well, 1 out of 10 Americans will agree with the statement, Congress cares what constituent thinks. 9 out of 10 members of Congress, 95%, the number one answer said staying in touch with constituents is the most important aspect of their job. So while you might think it's a House of Cards world, in reality, it's a lot more like Schoolhouse Rock. And that's a good thing. Now, you might say, well, everything I see on TV is them yelling at each other and arguing. Yeah, if they're talking about guns, abortion, immigration, yeah, they're going to yell at each other a lot because those issues determine election outcomes. Those are also reputational issues. When they give their last speech, when that last editorial is written about them in the local paper, they're going to talk about how they stood on the national issues. I'd love to say that members of Congress have won and lost elections based on your issue on whether we should have a constitutional amendment. It doesn't happen. That means they actually have a lot more flexibility on your issues than you might think. They can sign on to this. They can support it. It's not like the leadership is counting noses and counting heads. So they have a lot more flexibility here. So what I'm going to do in the next 20, 25 minutes is first talk about how the coronavirus briefly has changed how Congress is working with constituents. So it's good to have that framework. Understand the different strategies for participating in a larger group or a smaller group. Because some of you might have a large group of sessions where you're able to get 10 people maybe from a district or state to participate in a meeting. Others, it might be smaller, maybe just 2 people. And how to build relationships, how to build relationships remotely. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about. As I've said, we are an unusual organization that surveys congressional staff. And the first thing I want to talk to about is this survey we did of congressional staff very recently on the coronavirus. So we asked you, do you agree or disagree with this statement? I agree that groups with constituents in our district or state should be communicating with our office on the following topics. Now, the first 2 answers aren't shocking. 96% of congressional staff think issues limited to COVID-19 and issues indirectly connected to COVID-19 is something we should talk about. But check this out. Issues not connected to COVID-19, 8 out of 10 staffers said, talk to us about that. They are fully functional, even though many of them are remote. And just to give you a little flavor of what some of the things they talked about in the open-ended answers of the survey, we asked, how are you doing? Right? Just a good question that anybody should be asking as you start a conversation. One staffer said, each day is a new adjustment either to the workload, constantly changing circumstances, or the general unknowns. It's difficult prioritizing all the challenges constituents are facing right now. And my personal favorite quote, okay, but stressed and sometimes annoyed with my sick husband, which sounds like something one of us might have said. So congressional staff are real people too. They're dealing with the same sort of challenges. The difference is a lot of people are bombarding them. So whether they're a candidate running for office or they're a incumbent running for office, recognize that they're under a great deal of stress right now as we're going to the final weeks of this campaign. The other thing I want to share with you is that the internet changed everything. Here's a picture of Al Gore with the internet, very good picture of Al. And he didn't really say he invented it, by the way. The internet changed the economics of advocacy. So you need to know that this is an environment that you're going to be wading into that is over-communicated, that is saturated with messages and demands on their time. Let me just give you some statistics from one congressional district. This is one district, didn't change much in redistricting over about an 18-year period. In 2001, 9,300 emails and letters went into this congressional district office from constituents. By 2011, that number had gone up to 48,000. And the first year of Donald Trump, it was 123,000. That shows you that they're over communicating. That means the translation for you is having one-on-one or what we call grass tops meetings or calls with these candidates and these members of Congress is way more important than generating thousands of emails, because this is definitely an era that is starting to end. Emails are still going to have some influence, but you have to generate a lot of them. So the outreach that you're doing to try to get candidates on the phone, to try to get a conversation with an incumbent or a member of their staff or their campaign staff, this is vital because that's what they're listening to these days. Let me amplify that with our first data point from a congressional staff survey we've been doing for 17 years. And we've asked the same question 3 different times. We always get the same data in the same order. And the question goes like this. If your member or senator has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And what we found is form email messages, not so much. Visit from a lobbyist, not so much. But once you individualize that message and talk about the influence of you and your family and your community, that makes a difference. Contact from a constituent representative, that is everybody on this call. You can all point to other people in your community that believe the same way you do and have signed on to American Promise. And in-person meetings, look at this. This means that when you actually get that opportunity to meet with them, it really does make a difference. So the next question I want to go, and I'm going to skip over this quote here in the interest of time, is this is a really important question. If your member has not arrived at a firm decision on an issue, approximately how many email messages from people who represent many constituents, such as an organization leader, elected official, or business owner, does it take for your office to consider taking the action requested? You may not look at yourself as an organization leader, but you are, because you're with a nonprofit that's growing on an issue that is central to our democratic values and our democracy. And that's the way that congressional staff and members are going to look at you. It may be that you're introducing yourself for the first time, but over time, they're going to know that there are other people with American Promise that you're representing. And so that's really important. And here's the data, because a lot of people think Congress doesn't care what people think. So check this out. The total number of people that need to get the attention of a member of Congress, less than 10. 55%, a majority said less than 10. Congress isn't listening? Look at this. Less than 10 people can get their attention. Now, here's a couple of things to do if you have other people in your network. 1, try to get them to contact the lawmaker within the same week. Meaning, if you've got a couple people that are making the request that the lawmaker consider signing the pledge, try to compress it. Don't spread it out. Think of it like a waterfall, and you want it all flowing at them at the same time. Secondly, diversifying voices is a big deal. If I got, when I was the chief of staff, if I got an email from an environmentalist asking us to sign on to a clean water bill, and then a week later, or less than a week later, I got another email from the head of the Rotary Club saying it was important to them, I'd be like, whoa, the Rotary Club is on the same page as the Sierra Club? That's weird. I would take notice. So if you've got people in your network that are a little diverse, that is an asset. That is helpful because they're politicians. If they can say yes once to 2 people and make 2 people happy, they're going to do it. Just do the math. The other numbers are similarly supportive of the idea that, again, just a few people can make a difference. Now, I'm going to bring on this show here a special guest star, someone who is a heroine of mine when I was growing up, and I got the bug of politics and history. One of the persons that gave me that bug was this amazing person who we lost last year, Cokie Roberts, who was on This Week with David Brinkley with Sam Donaldson and George Will, for those of you old enough to remember that show. And I'd watch it every Sunday morning, or I'd tape it so I could watch it when I got back from church. And it just was a really valuable lesson in politics. And I've had the opportunity before she passed to meet, actually had lunch with Cokie once. She was as charming and as brilliant in person as she was on radio and television. But one thing you may not know about Cokie is both of her parents served in Congress. Her father was Hal Boggs, who was a congressman from Louisiana, who rose to be House Majority Leader before he died tragically in a plane crash. Then her mom, Lindy Boggs, ran for that seat, won it, and served for 17 years later. So she grew up in DC. Statuary Hall was her playground. And she did a segment some years ago on NPR Morning Edition called Ask Cokie. Awesome segment. Listeners could call in or email in a question. And she got a question on one of the segments that I happened to catch and record related to this topic of being a constituent and how your voice matters. Listen in.
Well, I love this one that we're going to talk about because we should say both of your parents were members of Congress. And Catherine Bulletin, she wrote this question: what weight do politicians give to phone calls and letters? What's the most effective way to influence our congresspeople? What do you think?
That's actually a terrific question. And the answer is that they give tremendous weight to letters and phone calls from people in their districts. If you send blast emails from some sort of organization or postcards or worst of all, phone calls, they are not only not likely to pay attention, but they're likely to get annoyed.
Get ticked off.
If you go into a congressional office and there's some phone bank thing going on, you'll see some poor harassed child sitting at the desk.
Dealing with all the phone calls.
Dealing with all the phone calls.
Welcome to my office. This is your first job.
But if it's somebody who is from the district, and particularly if it's someone who's active in the community in the district, members of Congress pay a tremendous amount of attention to those people. And the truth is, if people from a member's district go to their offices and see that member, it really can make a difference.
So if they're active in the district, if they go to their office, in this case virtually, it can make a difference. And so while you may look at a lot of these corporations and other large groups that can generate a lot of messages, what I and Koki is telling you is that doesn't matter. It just having that one-to-one contact is what really matters to members of Congress and staff and candidates. So I'm going to take you down even deeper into the brain of a member of Congress, because if you know how they think, you're going to be able to influence them. No actual live member of Congress was used for this experiment. I know that disappoints some of you. So this is based on my experience of working with the Congress for 30 years. The biggest part of their brain wants to make a difference in the world. You know, the average work week for a member of Congress when they're in session is over 70 hours a week. They make significant sacrifices. They miss a lot of birthdays, a lot of Little League games, because they want to make a difference in the world. They also want to please everyone. This is the weird thing. You're walking into a setting where they are hardwired to say yes to you. They're politicians. One member of Congress said to me, he said, I think all members of Congress are middle children still trying to please their father. And that is so absolutely true. They also have an ego. If they don't have one when they come to Washington, one is issued to them. And of course, they have this ability to raise money, big part of what you're doing. Now, I know some of you are a little more expert here, and you might be saying this chart is a little off. And you're right, this is the brain of a freshman lawmaker after they've been in Congress a little while longer. The ego takes over the larger part of the brain. We've tried to block it with drugs, doesn't work. Now, for those of you looking really carefully, they got a little dot right here, and you're wondering, what is that dot? That's the amount of time they spend thinking about your issues. Okay, 70 hours a week, average daily meetings, 13, 14 meetings a day, multiply times 5, literally over 40, 50 meetings a week. You may be just one of 50. Part of your challenge is to get noticed, is to get recognized, and is to have your voice make a difference. So let's talk about how to build relationships, not just, and I'll be talking about how to have meetings and how to get meetings throughout this part of the presentation. But if you just look at this as a one and done matter, you will lose. You will not be effective. If you look at it as, I'm going to keep at this, if I'm going to politely and persistently petition my government for redress of grievances, you will be much more successful. So to start this out, I'm going to tell you a case study, because you may have other people in your network that can get you farther with that lawmaker, and you may not even know they're there. So let me give you this case study. This happened a few years ago to the American Academy of Dermatology. And the Department of Health and Human Services had reclassified one of their procedures, and it was wreaking havoc with their practices. So the dermatologist in this particular case was complaining one night to her daughter, adult daughter, who had come home with a friend. And the friend said, you know, I think my mom went to college with somebody who's in Congress now. So some phone calls were exchanged, texts were exchanged, the two moms talked. A couple days later, the mom calls the doctor, the dermatologist, and says, you got a meeting in Washington, D.C. next week. Get on a plane. She got on a plane. She had the meeting. She met with the senator in question, Senator Trent Lott, who at the time was the Senate Majority Leader. Legislation overturning that regulation was passed in 6 months. Now, let's take a look at that connection. Here you had a doctor that had a daughter, who had a friend, who had a mom, who went to college 2 or 3 decades earlier with a guy who went to Congress who became the Senate Majority Leader. the message to you is, if you're not making a connection and you're not getting your phone call returned, or you don't think you can get the attention of the candidate or a member of Congress or staff, ask a friend. Explore what connections you might have in your network that can build that connection. So let's talk a little bit now about what you want to do when you interact with that lawmaker, what they're going to be listening for. And one of the survey questions that we have asked in our survey is, how helpful is it for messages from constituents to include the following? And by the way, we referenced not just messages. In another survey, we asked about social media. In another survey, we asked about in-person meetings. We got the top 3 answers every time. And it goes like this: information about the impact the bill would have on the district or state. What would taking money out of politics mean for your community? What sort of priorities would change? The constituents' reasoning. This is especially important for all of you. Proving that you have understand the issue in a way that you can communicate it to the lawmaker. Here you got data saying that they're interested in that. And also, if you can convey a personal story and talk about how that's a little harder with your issue than most issues to translate it. You could talk about talking about this with friends and how your friends have reacted to the idea of taking money out of politics. You could talk about how you've raised it in other either focus groups or other group settings. Because anytime you can talk about other people and their reaction and how they felt, you're going to get the attention of lawmakers. And let me just amplify and talk about the value of a personal story. And this is a true story I'm about to tell you. Guy walks into a doctor's office. No, it's not the beginning of a joke. Guy walks into a doctor's office. He's nervous. He doesn't have any health insurance, and he knows he's sick. And the doctor examines him and says, we got to do a lot of tests. And he's uncomfortable with this. And then the office manager comes in and has him sign a lot of pieces of paper agreeing to pay for these tests. He felt like this was unfair. He said, this is just not fair. And he told his congressman, and his congressman agreed. And his congressman introduced a piece of legislation. Folks, this is the actual legislation, the actual bill title of H.R. 2784. No private contracts to be negotiated when the patient is buck naked Act of 1997. This is a true actual piece of legislation introduced by Pete Stark of California, quickly became known as the Stark Naked Act of 1997. And this is the actual legislative language I'm reading to you from the bill to promote equality in the negotiation of private contracts. The Secretary of the Department of HHS shall issue regulations prohibiting the discussion or signing of private contracts at any time when A, the patient is buck naked and the doctor is fully clothed, and conversely, to protect the rights of the doctors when the patient is fully clothed and the doctor is naked. Secondly, the patient is wearing one of those short, flimsy little hospital gowns that don't close in the back. Or C, during any sigmoidoscopic or proctoscopic examination of the gastrointestinal tract. So this was one guy's story and it became a bill. By the way, it got 17 co-sponsors. The point is, can you tell a personal story? Can you talk about how this constitutional amendment means to you? Can you talk about how you have interacted with other people in your community and how they've reacted to it? That's going to get their attention. That's going to get them listening to you in a different kind of way than just giving them talking points about how much money was in politics. Trust me, members of Congress know that. But tell a personal story or ask it from their perspective. Congressman, wouldn't you like to spend less time raising money? Okay, that's a personal story from their perspective. All right, let's talk a little bit about what they're looking for when they get into an actual interaction with lawmakers. So this was a survey question that we did of congressional staff on how frequently do you experience the following in constituent meetings. So this is what's good and this is what's bad when they actually are interacting with you. So this is some pretty meaty stuff for you. So what we see is 90% said they didn't have impact on the district or state. Talk about how many people are in American Promise in your state. Didn't know the member's history or policy on the issue. Research what they've done. Have they co-sponsored legislation in the past? If you don't, talk to American Promise, they can help to. Were they unspecific with their request? That's not a problem. You got it very clear, sign the pledge. That's great. Didn't convey a personal story. And please don't be rude to your member of Congress. Starting your conversation with, I pay your salary, isn't actually exactly out of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and yet people still do it. So another thing you should think about with a long-term relationship, if this incumbent is there or if this candidate becomes a member of Congress or a state legislator, and I know you're working with Congress, is build the relationship with the staff. One of the most valuable things you can get in the world is a staff email address. That's a very valuable thing. I used to run a company that sold them. I know it's valuable. My kids are going to college on that idea. It's very valuable. Do you want to get to know these senators? Yeah. But sitting for 4 hours on that really uncomfortable bench with somebody like me in my 20s It's this guy right here. Now, keep in mind that the average age of a congressional staffer is 27. They're not going to seem like they understand the issues, but these are the best and brightest folks. So build relationships with those staff members. A couple tips. If you get an email address of a staffer, here are some tips for emailing congressional staff. Make sure the subject line is very clear what you're emailing about. Sign the pledge. Meet with me. Give me a call. Remember that they live on their phones. They're millennials. These things are surgically attached to their hands at birth. Keep it short and relevant. No more than 4 or 5 sentences. Don't write a lengthy tome. Send them a link for more information if they need it because they're looking at it on their phone. If there's a timing issue, the election's coming up. You don't need to know that one. It's time. The election's coming. And thank them for even listening. And the key times to reach congressional staff, and don't tell staff I told you this, are nights and weekends. Now, the next strategy I'm going to share with you that to connect with a lawmaker is for this group, probably the best strategy. And you may not have time in the next 3 weeks, and this may not happen, but it certainly will in 2021, I guarantee you. And that is telephone town hall meetings. One of the areas that we saw telephone town hall and online town halls shot up by anywhere from 300 to 400% during the coronavirus. And most staffers say it's here to stay. And these are good things. These are not just sessions where members of Congress filter out and censor out people they don't want to hear from. That is bunk. That's not what happens. So go to these town hall meetings. Here's a couple tips for when you're in a telephone town hall meeting. First, get invited. The best way to do that is to sign up to the Member of Congress's e-newsletter. Most members invite people to telephone town hall meetings who have subscribed to their e-newsletter. Always ask a question. So that means once you get that call, because it's going to be, you're going to get called out or you're going to get a link and they're going to say you right away, ask a question. Most of these meetings are 60 minutes, which means the most they can get is about 10 questions in, because members talk too much and listen too less, but that's another issue. Recognize you're on a big stage and you're going to get your question vetted. That doesn't mean they're censoring out. They're just trying to weed out crazy people who are going to swear at them. And when I say a big stage, the average number of constituents on a telephone town hall meeting is between 3,000 and 7,000 people. So this is your best forum, folks. If you ask a question on whether they will sign a pledge to sign on to agree to a constitutional amendment to take money out of politics, that's the ballgame. That's the metric that you're looking for. Establish your credentials. You're a growing nonprofit. Make sure they understand. And you say, I'm with American Promise. I agree. I encourage people to talk from a written statement. It's always a little better. And praise the legislator, even just for listening. The last area I want to encourage you to use, especially remotely, is social media. Every member of Congress monitors their social media account very closely. And just like people who are connected to an organization, they don't need that many people to get their attention. We did a survey of congressional staff and asked them this question: how many similar comments on a social media post is enough for your office to pay attention to? And just like with email, what we found, it's a really small number. 35% said less than 10, 45% said 10 to 30, 80% said under 30. You get 5 or 6 people to tweet at a member of Congress in the same day to sign a pledge. After they've gotten a couple phone calls in, they will read it. They will pay attention. I'm not saying they'll agree. I'm not saying you'll get what you want, but democracy will have worked. You will have at least gotten through to them and got that request in. Another thing that's really helpful to do is identify yourself. And the reason I know that is it's the last data point I'm going to share with you. If your member of Congress has not arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might social media posts directed to your office, including posts on your office or member platforms, from the following have on his or her decision? And what you can see here in this chart is once you identify yourself as a leader or representative of a group, which you are, or you can get multiple people saying you're with a group, you're going to get their attention. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this part of the presentation, stop sharing, and start taking your questions. But that's basically the basics on how to influence lawmakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. I'm thinking back to that visualization you've put up of the brain and thinking, well, okay, our issue is that small little speck, and how can we magnify that as much as possible? So as you're thinking of questions, again, use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We've got a really good one here from Amira Mansour, who says, are congressional representatives doing Zoom meetings with constituents? And if so, what's going to happen after the pandemic? Do you think this will still be an option for constituents?
They are, and what we're hearing is staff are doing a lot of phone calls. And so don't feel Brad if they want to do a phone call. When we ask congressional staff and follow-up questions, why aren't you doing Zoom meetings? The two answers we got mostly from legislative assistants was, one, I don't want to put on a shirt with a collar. I want to wear a t-shirt and I don't want to look bad. And they want to stay in their jammies. And second, many live in Washington, D.C., and they can't afford to live alone. They live with roommates and they're all working at the communal table and they just can't do a Zoom call. So it's okay with phone calls. What we found is what moves the level up from a phone call with staffer to a Zoom call with the member is multiple constituents from around the district. So if you can get 3 or 4 people or 5 people, and that's all you need to say, I want to talk to the member about this, you'll probably get a meeting maybe with the chief of staff or district director and you move up. And yes, we ask them if they predict whether or not these meetings are going to continue remotely. And something like 3 out of 4 staffers said yes. And keep in mind, the Congress, my prediction is, this is my personal prediction, knowing Congress, following this issue as closely as I do, I don't think it's going to open to the public until the 3rd quarter of 2021. I just don't see it happening, that they're going to be having in-person meetings. They might in the district or state, but I doubt it, especially when they can do this.
Perfect, makes sense. And we've got another question. It's a good one, and I'll, I think, parlay it into a bigger one. Kim asks, for incumbents running for re-election, is it, say right now, hypothetically, is it better to use a personal or campaign email filed with the Department of Elections or to use their congressional email? And I'm hoping you can speak to that and sort of a larger question of what are some of the core differences communicating with candidates and communicating with elected officials?
You know, believe it or not, it's not a lot. It's more nuanced on the individual. But okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd go both. If I was sending a message in, the best thing you want is the chief of staff and campaign manager talking to each other saying, I think we need to take this meeting. That's what you want. And be honest, say, I've also reached out to the campaign, you know, to talk about. So it's okay to reach out to both. Normally, we don't advise people to do that, but in a campaign setting, we would, because this is a campaign issue and you want to get their attention. So I'd go on both platforms, let them know that you're doing. But again, as you saw, getting multiple people to do it, especially people who have some standing in the community, that's going to make a difference, just like Cokie Roberts said.
Perfect. Thank you. So you said you've been in Congress since, I think, 1988. You've served in various positions, worked for numerous members of Congress. You've started a couple companies since then related to politics. A lot of people get dispirited in politics once they spend enough time around it. Is that the case for you? And if not, what just gives you hope and sort of the drive to keep doing this?
Well, as you can tell, I haven't. I'm an enthusiastic person and I am a perpetual optimist, and maybe that sometimes is considered naive, but it's because I see a different Congress than you see. You know, you see the one on the evening news, you see the one that got pulled up on ethics charges, you know, and I'm not saying that the American public doesn't occasionally send a cad, a criminal, dare I say wiener, to the halls of Congress. They do. But most of the people I get to work with are amazing people. I encourage all of you to take a look. I'm going to blatant plug for my website at congressfoundation.org. Go take a look at the Democracy Awards. It's like the Oscars for Congress. We just had them last Tuesday. They're a week old. We announced these 8 amazing members of Congress that are demonstrating transparency and accountability, that are innovating in a very entrepreneurial way, that are providing great customer service, constituent service, Democrats and Republicans. It's the 3rd year of the Democracy Awards. It was a great program this year. It was all virtual. You're looking at Democracy Awards headquarters. If you're here a week ago, it had a big logo of Democracy Awards, but I put my office back together last week. I think after you watch those 64 minutes, you'll be an optimist too, because there's a lot of good happening in Congress. You just don't hear a lot about it.
Fantastic. And we'll be sure to include a link to that website in the recap email that we send out tomorrow. But Brad, thank you again for joining us and for leading us in presentation. We've answered all the questions folks have and want to just turn it back to you for any final thoughts before we transition to the call.
Thanks. My final thought, you know, when I first met Jeff Clement, you want to talk about an optimist? I mean, he puts me to shame. I've just been really impressed. We're a nonpartisan organization, so we don't take a stand on bills and legislation. And it's one of the reasons why we have extraordinary credibility with leadership, freshmen, Democrat, Republican. But after going to your conference a couple of years ago, I was just really blown away with both the passion and the dedication. And so I would simply say, keep at it. Constitutional amendments take time. It's a very difficult process and path you're going. But my personal view, and I told this to Jeff the first time I talked, I think it's the only way to go. I think you're on the right strategy. I don't think we've seen what happened to McCain-Feingold. It was completely gutted. We saw what Citizens United did. You're not going to do this with an act of Congress. It's just the Supreme Court has pretty much said that. So just personally, and again, I'm speaking as a person, I'm off the clock, so I can say that. I think you guys are on the right track, and I wish you all the luck in the world.
Well, much appreciated. I don't know, maybe anyone who knows more about Congress than you do. So it's affirming to hear you say that. And yeah, just because it's hard doesn't mean we don't have to do it. So.
And I'm going to drop off the call to let you guys finish your business. And I'm not saying be calm and wash your hands these days. It's live long and prosper, which I think for a struggling economy and for people in a pandemic is a lot better. That's my avatar, my Mr. Spock finger puppet. I think everybody needs an avatar. So grab your avatar next time you're in a Zoom call. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to your audience.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Have a good night. Fantastic. Well, I've never seen that closing remark done quite like that. But we'll transition to the last quarter of the call here, where we're really going to talk about the American Promise Pledge Program. Now that we've got sort of tips and tricks into how to effectively meet with elected officials and candidates running for public office, what is one of the most powerful things that we can be approaching them with? And that's the Candidate Pledge Program of American Promise. Elections are really big opportunities. They're when candidates are running for office. They're when that small little, pea-sized part of their brain thinking about our issue might be a little bit bigger as they're trying to get elected or reelected. And the goal of our Candidate Pledge Program is really to inform voters where their candidates stand on supporting this amendment. And it's maybe the single most impactful action, especially right now in the wake of an election, that you can take in your community. And I'm proud to say and happy to say that in 2017 and 2018, about 256 candidates took the pledge. And already in the new 2019-2020 cycle, 415 candidates have taken the pledge. And what's the cause of this increase? Well, it's a couple things. I think we're one more really expensive election in the books. People are increasingly sick and tired of it. There's increased exposure and awareness of the program. You don't have to spend time giving so much background information. And then the biggest factor is you guys on the call and doing this work all across the country, this growing network of Americans effectively using the tool. And I'm thrilled just to introduce one of those people here right now. It's Laura Knipmeyer, who is the leader of the California chapter of American Promise. She's been a leader in this movement since American Promise started, and maybe even before we started. She started a chapter in New Jersey, and then moved across the country and started a chapter in California. Among the many things that she does well, successfully using the candidate pledge, particularly recently with Republicans, stands out and is what we're going to talk about for a couple minutes to close out the call. So Laura, thank you for being here, and take it away.
Sure, my pleasure. Well, the move to California meant that I wasn't for sure going to stop the American Promise work. And I guess the reason I was asked to speak is because just the last 2 weeks, we've had great success getting 2 Republican congressional candidates to sign. And we're working really hard to let voters know that this has happened, because being cross-partisan is so important for getting the amendment, ultimately passed. In California, we have already a lot of co-sponsors for the House versions of the amendment bills, a lot. And we also have the state Proposition 59 since 2016, which makes us one of those states that's expected to ratify the amendment very quickly once Congress passes it. So we were thinking, you know, how could we use the candidate pledge to add value to the national effort? And where all levels of the pledge are important, it's really depending on the status of your state that may drive the level that's most important for advancing your situation. We decided really to focus on adding the Republican congressional candidates to bolster that critical mass in the national roster. As I said, the cross-partisan nature of the co-signers is just more and more essential in order to advance the cause. So if we could get some of those, and then we could publicize them under the banner of, you know, informing the voters that the Republicans had signed in our writing, then we could advance the amendment as a voting issue using this 2020 election cycle. So that meant we also had, you know, a deadline. We all have a deadline now, right? The end of the voting is coming up very quickly. So with our newly adopted statewide perspective as well, right? So American Promise was working with American Promise associations more locally the last several years. This summer, we got like a statewide perspective. I'm in the Bay Area, and almost all the districts we were going to work in, talk about, are in Southern California, where I didn't know a thing, I would say, before July. So this is all like recent work that's been done. But that also means that we could seek a higher profile for the media, like LA Times and things like that. So we'll come back to that in a second. California being a really big state, focus was key here. We have a really small group, and with the you know, with the pandemic challenge, you know how much extra time people have for stuff like this. So we worked on only 14 of the 53 districts, and these were either races where it was known they were very close, or because the electorate was least polarized. So doing a little homework on that, you know, took a little bit of time. Total, we had 6 volunteers that worked on this project. 2 of them I've never met, the 2 guys who helped us filling out the state database with the initial contact information. Nick Bartleman, thank you very much for doing that work, getting the contact information for the individuals involved from the campaign websites was really important. And so the rest of us then, 5 of us then agreed to either cover like 1 to 5 districts, and I did 4 of myself. The initial emails, we used different pitches based on the resource training on the American Promise website and the July 15th training that Shwari did on the candidate on the national training call. So we tailored each of those for Republican versus Democrat, incumbent versus challenger. So a little care to make sure that the initial email was very personalized to them. But we even went a little bit further by personalizing the opening line of each email. So this means we're using language from the candidate's actual website, and also offering our plan to launch the publicity for those who signed. So this issue matters to you, candidate, and also if you're signing this, we're going to get you as much publicity on this as possible. We also included a link to the what's quote the terrific pledge. We put terrific pledge graphic actually in the letter, in the email, and there we were careful to use a conservative Republican from New Mexico, so that when they go to the pledge page for American Promise, they may see, you know, a whole bunch of Democrats. That doesn't help the people we were trying to persuade. So we used one that we thought would help us. About 2 weeks later, maybe based on what Brad just said, we should have called earlier, right? We started calling to follow up. And, you know, I was afraid to engage them cold, so I had to make a little script to get started. And that was super helpful because that wound up being my voicemail when we didn't reach them directly. So since we didn't maybe reach them with the phone call, left a message, and then wrote the follow-up email right away that said, hey, I called this and this number, tried to reach you to follow up on this, for re-forwarding the email we had already sent them. And for the ones that we eventually signed, the 2 Republicans, we followed up, I say 5 to 7 times to get them. And, you know, to follow up on 28 candidates, so we did 14 districts, that's 28 candidates. It was just taking too much time to chase all of them. So we elected not to follow up with those incumbents that were already co-signers of one of the amendment bills. And we did that because we just wanted time to focus on writing letters to the editor and other media, you know, the publicity, rather than trying to chase down the individuals on each one. We were now ready to tally up what we did and tell our story to larger press. After the second call, you know, sometimes now we're getting a little weary. We started using the press agents and those numbers, and actually that got a little better response, trying a different number. We looked around for different, even second or third numbers we could get, looking on votesmart.org, or whatever. And now when I'm calling, I'm saying like, well, we're writing to inform the voters about money and politics, you know, instead of trying to convince them about the pledge. I would start off with my message that I'm going to go to the press, or I'm writing for the press already. So, you know, please call me back because we're going to write something. And usually I would say, and we can see from your website that this is an issue that's important to you. So, you know, they knew it was relevant. It happens that in California, a couple of the Democrats in these races have, you know, 10 times more money than the Republicans that are challenging them. So, you know, as moderate Republicans, these candidates are really running in a hard competitive environment. And so anyway, in any case of the response by the press agent or by emailing the candidates for follow-up, I actually asked them which media outlets are important for your constituents. So that saved us a little bit of research time for where, you know, which papers to send to. And they also contributed the ideas of going to the local TV and radio stations, which in LA is really important. So we could add that to our database. We actually added columns for the media contacts, the name of that, you know, the political editor and the phone numbers right next to on the same line as the candidates in our database. So in the end, what we wound up doing was publishing a table in our project as a press release. And there we noted the pledge signers. We called out the co-sponsors of existing bills. And also we made a column for the dollar numbers, you know, raised for the 28 candidates. And I wanted to send the outcome as a table because as a background piece, I wanted to send something that didn't have any spin on it. I felt like, you know, as soon as I chose a verb or an adjective, there would be some bias, you know, given there. So we just published it that way. And we sent it to the regional press, TV, radio, political editors, also business outlets, including one in Spanish, which is also very important for Southern California. Now we're writing the letters to the editor, having published the press release, and specifically mentioning the names of the Republican signers. And it's a lot of work right now, but time's almost up. You know, it's not like a lot of work all the time, just right now, these 2 weeks is crunch time. So we're still hopeful though about calling the rest of the candidates, you know, getting more than 2 of them. And for at least the next 2 weeks, you know, that'll be the time when most voters are mailing their ballots. So
fantastic, Laura. Well, you've built a sophisticated operation with people that you've never even met, compiling databases and collaboratively sharing that information, you know, using a lot of the tips that we heard Brad mention of personalizing the subject line, tailoring your message based on their website or their political priorities in the past, and then getting the pledge, but going one step further and trying to make a news story out of it, or engaging local media with letters to the editor. Hypothetically, say you were brand new to American Promise and you weren't connected with a great chapter, and long-term you wanted to maybe start one or join one, but at the present moment, you just wanted to do something and you said, okay, well, this candidate pledge seems like a timely thing. What advice would you have for one person, maybe not yet in a chapter, of just using this effectively, maybe without as much background knowledge or experience as you currently have?
Sure. Well, first of all, you can do it if you do it tomorrow. do it today, maybe not today, but you do it tomorrow for sure. And it's not difficult because the first thing you need to do is think about which are the close races. Like, be selective. Do the one you know, or do one that you don't know that you think is going to be close, because then you'll have something to focus on, concretely. The resources are on the American Promise website, so you can go right to the resource library, get into the pledge, and the text of what you need to send them has already been tailored there, except for that intro line that you need, which you get by just reading their website. And that's where you just craft one sentence saying, you've read the website and this is how the pledge fits in their goals. That's all there is. And after that, you should call the next day and the next day, and then have your friend call the third day. And then you've done what you can do. And if you get one in, 3-4 days right now, then you got to think about, or you can think about now, where am I going to write something to tell the world that this is happening? I was pleased to hear Brad say social media, because we're just learning how to do that now and thinking about how to leverage that. And turns out if you have just a little piece of data between who's got what kind of money and who's signed it or who's a supporter, you can publish something pretty darn quickly.
Absolutely. The biggest thing is just to jump right in and not to be afraid to, follow up if you don't hear, back, immedially. We've got a question from
you're a professional by the time you do 3.
That's right.
You know a lot after you've done 3. So, yeah.
We've got a question from Joshua here in the chat. He says, I'm an independent candidate running against a Republican. How can this help me? I believe in this cause. At a state level, what can I do? And I'll answer both of those questions. If for people who sign the pledge, we do a couple of things. We put them in our public database of pledge signers at americanpromise.net/pledge. And we create a social media graphic for Facebook, for Twitter, for Instagram, that you can use in your social media circles however you want to. And we'll also circulate that graphic and news of you signing the pledge to our national network. So those are the 3 things that will happen if you sign the pledge. Joshua, I've answered your question in the Q&A here. And then to your second question, which is a good one, well, at the state level, how can this move the amendment forward? Well, in a big way is how. Constitutional amendments, all 27 so far, have happened when 2/3 of Congress, supermajorities in the House and Senate, agree on language, send it out to the states, where 38 state legislatures need to ratify the amendment that Congress sends out to them. So depending on where you are, there will be a different legislative history in your state legislature, but would be very happy to connect with you offline about how to make an impact at the state level. If you're a county commissioner, if you're a city councilor, if you're any public office, you can meaningfully advance this amendment, and that's one of the key takeaways here. So it's about 9 o'clock here on the East Coast. We're going to wrap up on time, but Laura, thank you in particular for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone who tuned in and listened to the call. Laura, any last words for the attendees here as we close out the call?
It's great to see everyone. Now go vote.
All right, yes, go vote and use the candidate pledge, and make sure your fellow voters know where their candidates stand on this crucial issue as we try to fix our broken democracy. So thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go ahead and end the call, and have a good night, everyone.